Hello everyone and welcome to another video of Chess Down Under. I am a Aussie chess expert with an online rating of 2,400, and in today's video we'll be doing something a little bit different. You might have heard the saying that chess is 99% tactics. Now, I can personally attest to the idea that tactical vision and being able to solve tactical puzzles is one of the most important skills that you can have as a chess player. I mean, it's how we knock out our opponents, it's how we deliver checkmate, it's how we win material. It's one of the most important things in all of chess. In today's video, what I'll be doing is I'll be solving 10 different tactics puzzles that I haven't seen before live, and I'll be talking through exactly what I'm thinking, the different patterns that I'm looking at, and the different calculation techniques that I'm using as well to solve these problems. Okay, let's start solving some tactics. Okay, let's get into the first tactical puzzle. This is the first time I've seen this position, so let's just unpack what my brain is thinking and what my eyes are seeing. I'm first just taking in the whole position as a whole. I'm scanning the entire board, just trying to understand where the pieces are, because solving a tactical puzzle and finding what the best move is in a particular chess position involves you understanding the entire board as a whole. It's not just, okay, let's look at this particular part of the board because there seems to be a lot of action there. You need to take in the entire board as a whole and understand the possibilities there. So the first thing that my eyes are always drawn to in any chess position is looking at the kings, right? The king is the most important part of the game because once you get checkmated, that's the end of the game. That is the goal of the game. So naturally, my eyes immediately look at the kings, and I can see both the white and the black king are in the center of the board. So immediately that gives me a bit of a spider sense that there might be some tactical shots here because the kings are in the middle, and not only are they in the middle, but they're somewhat exposed as well. They don't have the greatest shelter. Now, the next thing that my eyes get naturally drawn to is whenever there are contact between pieces. So we can see that there is contact here both ways. The white queen has contact with the bishop, the black bishop has contact with the white queen. The two knights have contact with each other. The white queen has contact with the pawn on b4. The white queen has contact with the pawn on e6 as well. We have contact here. But not only immediate contact, what my eyes also see is X-ray contact as well. And this one here is very interesting to me. So we have an X-ray against the rook, but we also have X-ray contact against a square as well. So we've got X-ray against an interesting potential check as well. So those are the first things that my eyes always look at in a new chess position. What contact is there between current pieces? What X-ray contact is there? And you can draw X-ray lines even through things that seem almost impenetrable. So my eye also sees that my queen has got X-ray to f7 as well. Now in this particular position that probably doesn't mean much, but in some situations drawing those X-ray lines through almost impenetrable shields actually opens up some interesting tactical possibilities. So we've now had a look at the current contact points, the X-ray contact between pieces as well. The next thing I'll look at is, okay, well, this is the current contact between the pieces. What about potential contact? I can see that, well, if my knight comes in here, we've got potential contact with the king. We've got potential contact with the rook hitting the queen as well. We've got black with potential X-ray contact with the queen. I mean, this is a pretty important detail in the position at the moment, but these are some of the things that my brain will be naturally just doing in a split second. My brain will just see, okay, yep, here are the contact points. Here are the X-rays in the position. Here are the potential contact opportunities. And so my brain starts working through these things, and now we start to unpack possibilities. So that first phase is really, I guess, taking in the position as a whole and understanding the different contact points between the pieces and their possibilities. once I've done that, in a real game, it's kind of a subconscious process that happens almost automatically. Once I've taken in the position and understood the different contact points, then I start to think about, okay, what are the different possibilities? Which of these contact points are the most important that I should start focusing my active mental energy on? So obviously one of the important contact points is the bishop against our queen. My eye is drawn to that very quickly. Our queen is under attack, but I'm also really drawn to the bishop's scope and activity as well along here. Not only hitting the rook, but also this c6 square as well, because if our bishop can land on c6 and give a check, actually that could be like pretty devastating. So at the moment I'm just looking at, well, if I take that knight and he takes our queen, that's okay. Sometimes we need to sacrifice our queen to deliver some interesting tactical shots. We take the knight, he takes our queen, our bishop is now opened up. We land on c6, giving a check. And that's a pretty devastating check actually, because the king can't move anywhere. He's blocked. The only thing that black would be able to do in that position is to block it with the queen. And remember, our knight will be on c5, guarding. So we basically just pick up the queen. So I think that's actually a really strong possibility. So now that my brain and my eyes have seen that as a strong possibility, I double check the sequence. I think, okay, if I first take this knight on c5, are there any unexpected tactical shots that black can play against me? Because yes, black can take my queen, but it's not a forced move, right? So does black have anything better than capturing my queen? Well, if he doesn't, it turns out that I've pretty much just won a free piece, right? Let's have a look to see how that plays out. I'll just play it on the board so that people can follow. If I take here, the sequence that I'm playing through my head at the moment is black takes my queen. I come in to c6 with check. There is nowhere for the king to go, so he has to interpose with the queen. And now it's absolutely devastating. I mean, we can just take the queen immediately. We can potentially even take with the knight and threaten some crazy discovered attacks as well. So I think like this would be pretty much lights out and our winning position. So once I see this position, I just stop calculating, and that's the end of that. There's no more calculating needing to be done. But before, I guess, proceeding through any tactical shot, we just need to double check that the opponent doesn't have any unexpected counter shots. So what I'm just thinking before I'd lock in this move, especially in a classical game, is, okay, after knight takes c5, are there any strange, unexpected tactical shots that black can make? So for example, what I'm thinking here is, well, instead of capturing the queen, is there something like a pin to recapture that piece? But that doesn't work because then we simply scoop up this bishop here. So it's really important that, when you see a strong continuation for yourself, you don't just immediately play it in a heartbeat, but you make sure that your opponent doesn't have any unexpected counter shots against you. Now, in this particular position, I don't think that there are any unexpected counter shots, because anytime, for example, the black pieces, for example, try to pin me and to try to recapture that piece, we simply take the bishop, and then we'd have two pieces for the one piece after they retake the knight. So I don't think that there are any strange tactical counter shots here. So let's see if that move, knight takes c5, was the correct move. Okay, I've just turned on the engine analysis, and it does say that the continuation that I saw was the right one. So knight takes c5 is the right continuation. Okay, let's get into our next puzzle. Okay, this is our second tactical puzzle, and my brain will be going through roughly the same process that we saw in the first one. I'm taking in the entire position as a whole. I'm looking at first the kings. We have both kings in the middle of the board once again, so there might be some potential tactical opportunities there. But in this situation, I can see that the kings have a bit more shelter and more pieces around them. So my instinct tells me that there probably isn't something directly related to the kings. What I am immediately drawn to is the contact points. Once again, we need to think about those. We have current contact here. we have some interesting contact here, and my eye is just immediately drawn to this potential contact of taking on c6, which would fork these two pieces. We have X-ray contact up here as well, and we've got some contact from the black side here, here. And so once I've taken into account the current contact points and potential contact as well, so we had a look at some X-rays as well. Now I start to unpack, okay, well, having a look at all of these different contact points and potential contact between the pieces, what are some of the sequences that I can start to think about? What are some of the actual concrete possibilities in the position? Now, my brain is really quickly drawn to, again, this idea here of taking on c6. It would be a fork, but I don't think that quite works, because whenever you fork two pieces, obviously it looks really great for you. But if one of the pieces can then just escape by capturing, then they kind of wriggle out of the fork. Now, the line doesn't continue just there though, because if we take on this pawn, forking the pieces, let's say he captures our knight, trying to get out of that fork, we take his knight, which is attacking his queen. That's an important detail there. So in that position, he'd have his queen under attack and the bishop under attack at the same time. But I can see that there's an issue there in that his queen would be able to retake our pawn with check, and then there are no more forks. At least my brain kind of stops the calculation at that point and sees, okay, he's gotten out of the situation there. He should be able to stabilize his position. So let's just play through that sequence of what I was calculating. I was looking at takes here. The knight takes to try to escape that fork. We retake that knight, and then he takes back with the queen. And that's a check. We'd need to do something about that. For example, bringing our queen, he'd be able to exchange queens, and then he'd just be able to save his bishop. So I don't think that is a crushing sequence, but one of the things we need to be aware of in terms of a technique when calculating tactics is, okay, I just concluded that this sequence isn't favorable for me. Well, what about this one? Instead of taking the knight, what if I take the bishop? So just because one particular sequence doesn't work, you then don't give up on the entire line completely. You can say, well, okay, let's scrap this particular line. Does this work? What if I take this one? So now I'm threatening the rook and the knight. But then in this situation, once again, the knight can escape with tempo. He can get out with check, which is an important detail. And then we retake. What happens here? This is really interesting actually, because we have our queen under attack and the rook under attack at the same time as well. This is a really fascinating puzzle actually. It's like fork after fork after fork. But once again, I think that black can just get out of this just by simply taking the queen. And the important detail here is that if white were to try to take the rook instead of retaking our queen and be, okay, like I'm taking a rook and I'm creating a new queen as well, well actually we just save our queen and black is winning here. So I think from that sequence, we can probably conclude that both of these don't really accomplish too much. It's not a like a knockout tactical shot by any means. Black manages to wriggle out of it. So I'm really drawn to this idea of forking these pieces, but it just doesn't work in this stage because that knight on d7 can exchange our knight on e5. So that seems to be a saving move for black. It's a saving kind of counter shot, like what we saw in the previous puzzle where I saw a tactical continuation and my brain immediately started to look for counter opportunities from my opponent. You know, does this actually work for me, or doesn't my opponent have a saving move? And it looks like in these possibilities, it's always the knight taking on e5 is the saving grace for black. So what I'm drawn to now immediately is just, can I just remove that as a possibility for black? I'm looking at just dropping the knight back to g4, attacking the queen. I think that's probably it here, because in all of these sequences, knight takes e5 was the way that black rescues himself from this fork. So if I simply drop my knight back to g4, attacking the queen, he has to do something to protect his queen. Let's say, for example, black drops his queen back to e7. Then I take on c6 with the fork, and black no longer has his saving grace attacking on e5 because my knight isn't there anymore. So I think that's probably the winning sequence. Now, once again, before I commit that, I need to see, are there any strong counter shots by my opponent? If I play knight to g4, does my opponent have any unexpected tactical shot against me? I'm looking at, okay, bishop takes c3, doesn't really accomplish much. We just retake. There's nothing he can really do to muster up an attack with his pieces. I mean, if he try, yeah, I just don't think that there's anything there. So I've done a quick scan of counter shots for my opponent, and I'm looking to lock in knight to g4, attacking the queen. So let's go back and see if that was the right continuation. Okay, knight g4 was the right sequence. So pat on the back there. So the sequence that the engine gives is knight to g4 and then queen to g6 coming in this way. But yeah, then we just simply take the pawn here. We are forking b7 and d7 as well, and we are going to win a piece. So very exciting puzzle, actually. Lots of just like fork after fork after fork. That was a pretty interesting puzzle. Okay, now onto our third example. And once again, I'm just taking in the entire position as a whole here. I'm looking at just absorbing where the different pieces are placed, just so that my eye hasn't missed a particular piece on a square. So I'm looking at the entire board, just scanning to see where all the pieces are. I can see the different king placements as well. So white's king looks pretty stable, although there might be some potential h3 business, potentially looking to open up some lines. Black's king does look a bit funny here because of this x-ray here. So it is something that is jumping out to me straight away. We can see we've got contact here, we've got contact here. So my eye's like very drawn to this particular aspect of the position at the moment. My knight is under attack. We have the bishop staring at c3 as well, which I'm not worried about too much at the moment because it seems to be well guarded. We have some interesting potential here as well for black. We have some interesting potential here as well. So lots of interesting potential activity for black that I can see. White could potentially start activating his rooks. So a lot of potential activity that I can see for both pieces. But one of the other things that I can see as well is, and this is a really important thing that you should try to develop as a piece of intuition for yourself as well, is I can see that these two pieces here on dark squares, the bishop on b4 and the rook on ba, are forkable by a knight as well. So if I jump out to here, I am hitting the rook and the bishop, which might potentially be an interesting kind of avenue to explore. And a lot of people get really tricked out by knight forks and knight hops. I have a very easy technique to help people spot knight forks. The way that the knight works is we can see that this knight here on e5 is on a dark square, right? It is hitting a bunch of light squares around us. So if we just draw the various squares that the knight is hitting, we can see that a knight on a dark square hits a lot of light squares around us, right? We can see all of this light square influence that the knight has on the board. But if the knight were to move somewhere, let's say here, it would be on a light square and it is starting to hit a bunch of dark squares, right? So a knight with every hop that it makes is alternating the color complex that it's attacking. So at the moment, the knight is on a dark square and hits light squares, but with one hop, the knight is going to start suddenly hitting dark squares. And the way that you spot knight forks really easily is just look at the color complexes. Look at what pieces are on dark squares, what pieces are on light squares. And a knight on a dark square has the potential to make a hop and fork dark squared pieces. So you really need to drill that pattern into your mind. So Whenever you see a knight on a particular color complex, like this knight, for example, here, it is a dark squared knight. So with one hop, it can fork dark squared pieces, okay? So let's think about that for a moment. Black has a number of pieces on dark squares, the rook, the bishop, and the queen, and we have two dark square knights. That means that with one hop of either of these knights, we might be able to start poking away and forking these pieces. So by simply looking at the color complexes, it really starts to hit those spider senses that there might be some forks in the air. And that's really as simple as it is sometimes, just paying attention to the color complexes. Which of your opponent's pieces are on light squares? Which of their pieces are on dark squares? Once we start paying attention to that, forks are suddenly really easy to visualize. So we can see here that we've got this fork here, knight to c6, hitting the rook and the bishop. But we also have a really interesting potential fork here as well. The knight jumping into d5 would be hitting the queen, hitting the bishop as well. That would be completely crushing, actually, but there are a few major issues with that, right? So if we jump in with our knight to d5, I think that most of you watching would be able to see some of the issues here. One of them is that, well, black can probably just take the knight with the pawn, because this knight here on e5 is actually blocking our pin. So if that knight weren't there, we'd be able to jump into d5 and give a pretty devastating fork, actually. But with this knight here, the pawn on e6 actually isn't pinned, so black would be able to take it. We'd have to look at the complications because we do have an open file and some potential discovered checks. White can try move the knight out of the way and look to do some crazy kung fu action, but I don't think any of it works. So what I'm looking at the moment is if black were to take the knight, opening up the e file, so he's walked into a discovered check. It's a very important point though that once the pawn has recaptured that knight, the pawn is actually striking our queen. So it's a pretty important detail. So if you think that you're winning, if you think that you're winning very easily by moving your knight somewhere, you need to remember that that pawn is actually hitting our queen. And anytime that knight moves to try to create some sort of devastating strike, he'd just take our queen, and that's how he'd get out of the discovered check. So let me just put that on the board so people can see. So what I was looking at is the knight jumps into d5, striking the queen and the bishop. Black takes the knight, and the important detail is that our queen is under attack now. So if you think that, moving the knight away to pick up the black queen is what you are banking on, well, no, because actually you lose your queen. So black stops the discovered check by simply taking the piece that was giving the check. And I think that coming in this way to d7 for the check, thinking that, hey, like if you take my queen here, I'm going to take your queen and we're going to do some funky kung fu with our knight. Actually, I think that black just simply takes the knight in that situation. And if you take the pawn here, we just need to remember the material balance. We just gave away two knights and we only got back one piece and a pawn in exchange. So actually what white is completely losing here. I don't see any follow-ups for him. I think that black should be able to scurry away, keep his king safe, and I don't think that there's any crushing sequence here. So I don't think that works. The immediate jump to d5 on account of e takes d5. But there's also the other issue as well. If for whatever reason black saw ghosts and was afraid of opening up that file and allowing some discovered checks, if black for whatever reason was scared of that possibility, he can actually always bail out just by taking our knight here. Remember, one of the first sets of contact point arrows that we drew in this position was that our knight on e5 is actually under attack at the moment. Black would simply just be able to bail out by taking our knight. And after we exchange queens and pick up this bishop here, it's really just been an exchange of pieces, right? So there's no material gain that has come about from that sequence for white. So it seems that I'd really love to play this move, knight to d5. My brain is really drawn to it because of the strength of this fork, but we can see that tactically it just doesn't work in this situation. The issue is really our knight here. The knight being here makes it so that the pawn is unpinned and can take, and the knight being here also means that black can always just bail out by taking on e5 with his queen. So using that same technique that we used in the previous examples, where we had an issue that was preventing our sequence from working, in this case, our issue is this knight on e5. Let's just make it not an issue anymore. Let's just move that knight, get it out of the way, and then after that knight isn't in the way, then I think that this threat here would be completely devastating. I'm now starting to look at, well, what are the ways that I can get my knight out of that position and follow up with this devastating strike? I'm looking at potential knight to c6 with this fork here, and I'm also looking at knight takes d7. I'm drawn to knight takes d7 because it just looks really forcing. If we take that knight, we're forking the queen and the rook, so it looks like black is forced to recapture. So after we take the knight, I think black is forced to recapture with the bishop. And then we jump in to d5, striking the queen and the bishop. And that looks initially really crushing to me, but one thing that I've just realized now, and I think that this would be a common maybe challenge that some people will face in trying to solve tactical puzzles, is that in that sequence I can see that black can try to hang on potentially by coming into b2. And so in this starting position here, I think that a lot of people might struggle to visualize the possibility that the queen might end up landing on b2 to try to hang on to the bishop, because in this starting position there are so many things in the way. We've got this guy in the way and this guy in the way. So it might be hard for people to visualize that the queen lands on b2 potentially. But we need to remember that in our sequence that we were calculating, we first got our e5 knight out of the way, then we got our c3 knight out of the way. So now suddenly this path has been cleared up. But I don't think that quite works for black. So I'm just playing through the sequence in my head at the moment. The queen has landed on b2, trying to hold on to the bishop. But in that situation, I think that we just move our rook across, kick the queen out of the way, and once the queen moves, I think we just pick up the bishop. Let me play out that sequence on the board just so people can follow. What I'm looking at is we first take on d7. Black is pretty much forced to recapture. We jump into d5 with our knight. Notice now, with our knight on e5 gone, black no longer seems to have his saving graces anymore. The pawn is pinned, so he can't take here. He can't simply move his queen out of the way with tempo, so it's a real issue now. The only thing that I can think he can do, that I was calculating through, is coming into b2 to try to hang on to his bishop. But I think that we just kick the queen out with rook to b1. The queen goes somewhere, doesn't really matter where, and then we just simply pick up the loose piece. But if we go back to this position here, one of the things that was quickly running through my mind as well just then was that if actually we tried to kick the queen out with the rook from f1 instead of the rook from a1, there was some pretty interesting possibilities that my brain were looking at for black here. Black could potentially try to slide all the way back to g7, and the reason to keep that queen on that square is that we have contact now with the rook on a1. And so there's just a little trick that white would need to be careful about. He'd need to make sure that he doesn't take the bishop with the rook, because oops, your rook on a1 would be hanging and the black queen would come in and pick that up. So white would need to take the bishop with the knight, and now black could try to open up that file. So now black is threatening to take our knight, because if we recapture, oops, once again, that rook on a1 is hanging. But it is now white to move, and I think that that white can stabilize his position. Worst case scenario, he can probably just move his knight that is under attack. And I don't think that black has anything that he can do to punish in that situation. So I think all of those sequences look pretty good for white. Just coming back to the starting position here, I'd be looking to lock that in as my move. Knight takes d7, bishop takes, and knight to d5. So yeah, let's lock that in and see what the engine thinks of our approach. Okay, so the engine does agree with us. Knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, knight d5 was the computer's recommendation in this position. But actually the computer also liked the other knight fork as well. So the knight jumping into c6 was also very strong as well. The computer gave bishop takes c3 and then knight takes b8 going up in exchange. The computer gave that as a pretty strong continuation as well. It did like knight takes d7 followed by knight d5 as the main line. So a very interesting puzzle here. I think that it was quite instructive in terms of understanding how we can very easily spot knight forks by paying attention to color complexes. But I think one of the other main takeaways to get from this example is just always to make sure that you are checking your opponent's counter shots as well, because yes, in this situation, things worked out for white, but we could see that actually black had some interesting ideas in terms of trying to hang on to the position. It didn't quite work out for black in the end, but he was able to create some complications, right? And we just needed to make sure that things work out in our favor. Okay, let's go to the next example. So once again, taking on the entire position here of the board, looking at where the different pieces are being placed. I'm looking at the kings as well. We can see both kings are actually kind of exposed. This black king actually is really short on breathing room at the moment. We've got some interesting pressure here. We've got possibilities for the knight to come in here. We've got the queen cutting him off. Potential opportunities for the queen to infiltrate maybe as well. So that black king is not looking too happy at the moment. In terms of other pieces getting involved, if we were to move our queen somewhere, we could potentially see the white rook getting involved somewhere as well. The black pieces have a bit of a hard time finding activity in the short term. It looks like there could be some interesting opportunities here against the black king is my initial reaction. I am looking at this x-ray here. Not a lot of immediate contact points in this position, but we have some potential contact points. We've got this interesting one here, and my brain is just immediately drawn to this check at the moment. I'm noticing also that we have some other contact points as well. We can hit the queen, and okay, the queen would be able to drop back. So that's something that I'm looking at as well at the moment. But I'm really just drawn to this check here at the moment. So if I give this check, the king is forced to e7. That's the only place that he can go. In that position there, if my queen were able to get onto d6, that would actually be checkmate. So can I boot his queen out? So his queen is what's guarding d6. So if I come into f6 with check, the king comes to e7. Now I really want to get into d6, but his queen is guarding that. So can I play a3 to kick him away? Okay, so this is another, I guess, thing to be aware of when you're calculating tactical sequences. At the moment, in the current position, we can see that the white knight is guarding these dark squares. And so a really common kind of miscalculation that people can make is what I was looking at was I come into f6 with my knight, he comes down with his king, I hit his queen with a3, and it's very easy to forget that actually in that position, black can slide across with his queen to c5. In this current position, with the pieces on the board, it looks impossible because that knight is guarding that square. But actually in our tactical sequence, the knight is not on e4 anymore. The knight is on f6. So a lot of the time when people are calculating tactical positions, it happens to me as well sometimes, we kind of get thrown off by the pieces that are on the board, kind of skewing our vision. So when I was calculating through that sequence initially, I thought that that was the end of that. The queen can't go anywhere to save checkmate because everything's taken. I thought that this square was taken by the knight. So it was just like a really common miscalculation that people can make. So what I'm looking at now is I'm thinking, can I switch up the move order? So that's one of the really common techniques as well in chess, in solving puzzles, is can you simply switch the move order? Instead of starting with knight f6 check, can we start with a3? Because if we start with a3, hitting his queen, the only real places he can go to are a5 or e7. If he goes to e7, it's game over because we give a check. The king can't go anywhere because our queen is covering that entire file. So he would have to sacrifice his queen on f6. Let's just play through that sequence. So if we go here, and then he tries to drop back and keep things guarded around his king. Actually, this is completely lost for black because we've given a check. The king can't go anywhere. We've got that file under control. He'd have to sacrifice his queen. So we can just quickly rule out that queen e7 is not a possibility. If, for example, he tries to go to a5, I think that this is just completely winning. We come into f6 with check and we're delivering checkmate. I think that's just the end of that. I think that's the tactical puzzle solved. I think it's just, I think a3 here. Let's just double check that after a3 we don't have any crazy counter shots from black, and no, I don't think that there's anything that can be done. You know, if he tries to take on b2, we just simply play our sequence and that's game over. Okay, so I think that's it. Let's have a look with the engine, and yes, a3 is winning. Okay, on to our next puzzle, and well, there is a lot happening here. So again, you know, taking on board the entire position as a whole, looking at all the different pieces. Boy, do we have a lot of action in this part of the board, that's for sure. Black is not really striking anything immediately. So the only real contact point that black has at the moment is here, which wouldn't accomplish anything. So black has a seemingly very active looking position with a good looking king, but he doesn't seem to have a lot of active ideas at his disposal. So with the white, we have some interesting potential, and we've also got interesting contact points here as well. And I think this is starting to give me some ideas as well, is that, well, we've got contact against this knight, which is kind of behind enemy lines here. Can we simply remove its guard? So that is just something that I was having a look at here. One of our contact points is bishop to c4. So my brain is immediately drawn to that. Of all the different lines that we drew so far, these ones here are the ones that are, I guess, like leaping out to me to try to explore. You know, is there any possibility here? So whenever you see a piece, you know, being guarded by a pawn, a lot of people might think, okay, that piece is impenetrable there. It's being protected by a pawn. It is, you know, untouchable. But actually that's not really the case, because a lot of the times we can simply remove that defensive piece. And so in this situation, simply removing this pawn is that what we do here. So if we take the pawn here on c4, is there anything that black can do? He can probably just escape with the knight, to be honest. And I don't think that there's any issues with that. Yeah, like he's lost his advanced knight, he's dropped the pawn here, but okay, it's not the end of the world. He'll just jump out with his knight. So now I'm thinking, is there another sequence that we can do to potentially exploit that? So now I'm having a look at this check here. Knight to d6, hitting the king and also hitting c4 as well. And I think that's actually a really interesting one now, because if we come in, give the king a check, the king will slide across to f8. We pick up that pawn on c4. And I think this is the important detail here, is that we are then striking the queen black would have to do something about his queen. But it's not just the queen that's being struck. After we have retaken that pawn on c4, it's actually a double attack. We are striking the queen, and we are also threatening to pick up his knight as well. So I think we're onto something here. Let's put it on the board so that people can follow the sequence at home. Knight to d6 check. The king, let's say for example, steps up to e7. Now we drop back to c4, and we are hitting the queen and the knight, right? So this is a double attack. Now, are there any shots here, anything unexpected that black can do to us? Because it looks like he's just about to lose a piece. Is there anything that he can do? It looks like he has to do something to save his queen. He's got to go back to c7 or something like that. Queen to c7, and then we simply pick up the knight there. So I think we're just winning a knight in this tactic, starting with knight to d6, and I don't see any counter shots after we take on c4. So I think that's the move we'll lock in here. So let's check with the engine. And yes, knight d6, king f8 it gave, then knight takes c4, queen c7, and then we pick up that knight. So that was the correct continuation. But the important thing for people to take from this puzzle is whenever you see a piece being protected by a pawn, don't just think that piece is untouchable, especially when there is already contact with that piece here, right? We can see there is heavy contact on that piece, so we can imagine that, if that pawn on c4 were to be removed, suddenly that piece there wouldn't be as secure as it once was. Okay, onto another puzzle. So again, taking on the entire board in its whole, looking at where the different pieces are being placed. I can see the white king is in a very unique position here on e3 with the black queen surrounding it as well. The black king doesn't look too happy as well. I can see immediately we've got a contact point here. That's quite interesting. So let's just have a look at the various different contact points. That's what my brain is looking at. This is a obvious one, giving the check. Black has contact here as well, which would be kind of interesting pressure on f3. I can see that's guarded at the moment. So I've got contact here, got potential contact like this. White can potentially look to open things up as well himself, because we've got some potential or contact up this way. And this looks like an interesting aspect to the position as well. So these are some of the things that a lot of club players can often oversee, is these long bishop moves or long queen moves or long influence from the other side of the board. A lot of the times tactics get opened up by a piece completely on the other side of the board. And if you're just like tunnel visioned, just like looking at one part of the board, you can forget that there's a really important piece at play here. So one of the sequences that I was looking at here was, instead of this guy here, if we kick the queen first, if that queen were to take the pawn on h2, then we'd simply slide back with our rook, hitting the queen again, and then we'd have like a pretty devastating attack against h7, and black would have to sacrifice his queen. So that is a potential contact point that I'm exploring at the moment. But I can see if we start with rook to b1, hitting the queen doesn't have to take that pawn on h2. The queen can simply slot into h3 instead, and we wouldn't be able to open up the file. I'm now actually looking at bishop to e6, and not for the sole purpose of just taking that pawn, but I'm looking at bishop to e6 for the purpose of guarding h3. So what I'm looking at now is we take on e6, it's a check, he moves to the corner of the board, and now we play rook to b1, and the queen has nowhere to go other than taking that pawn. We shuffle back with our rook, and we've just got a devastating attack there. Black will have to sacrifice his queen, and I think that's that's just game over. So let me put those moves on the board so people can follow along. So what I'm looking at is, actually I'll show the other sequence as well. So what I was looking at first was this one here. If the black queen takes that pawn, we move back with our rook, and if he were to get his queen out of line, then we can take here and we are crashing through, and that would be a devastating attack here. So that was the original sequence I was looking at, but we can see that after rook to b1, the queen is not forced to take that pawn on h2. She can hide on h3 instead. And so what I'm looking at now, and what I think is the correct continuation, is bishop takes e6 check, the king shuffles across, and now we hit that queen. She'd have to take the pawn on h2, and now we shuffle back, and then we've got a devastating checkmate threat there, so black would have to sacrifice the queen, and I think that's the end of that. So I think that's the correct sequence, bishop to e6. Let's have a look. Okay, yep, bishop to e6 was the correct continuation. So I guess one of the main takeaways from that position is just to always be aware of these long range pieces, right? It's something that is the demise of many club players, these lurking queens or lurking bishops on the other side of the board that can suddenly open up and wreak havoc on their position. Okay, now on to our next example here. Again, following the same approach that we have been doing in the previous videos, I am scanning the entire board, making sure that my brain has just registered all of the pieces, make sure I know what square everything is sitting on. Initially, I see that both of the kings are nicely tucked away. They look pretty safe. I don't think that there are going to be any tactical possibilities against either of the kings in this situation, as they look pretty safely tucked away and not a lot of kind of dangerous posturing around them. So I'm immediately now just, my eyes are looking at the contact points between the pieces. So my brain is very quickly drawn to this one here. I can see a lot of contact against the knight, which is only guarded once at the moment. So this might be a pretty important factor in the position. I can see we've got some interesting X-rays going on in the position as well. We've got contact here. So we've only got a few different pieces making contact with each other, but I can see that actually once we start moving away from current contact and into potential contact, my mind is really just thinking about, well, I can see that my knight is currently being put under a lot of pressure. If I move it, say to b3, and I hit the queen, moving that knight here is also opening up the X-ray against the bishop. And remember what I said earlier in the video, with X-rays, a lot of the times we can consider X-ray contact like just as good as regular contact between pieces. And once you start seeing X-rays with that type of potential, it really, I guess, like opens up your mind to easily unpacking and solving these types of tactical puzzles. So I'm immediately drawn to knight b3. It looks pretty crushing to me because we are striking the queen. Black would need to do something about that. But at the same time, we have opened up an attack against the bishop, which would then be guarded twice. And there will be no way that I can see for black to guard that piece. So before I'd lock in knight to b3, I just do a very quick scan just to make sure that knight b3 isn't walking into something crazy, some sort of crazy counter strike. I don't really see anything happening here. We've got things well guarded, and black would need to do something about the strike against the queen. So yeah, I'd be pretty confident locking in knight to b3 here pretty quickly. So again, we've opened up that X-ray against the bishop, and we're striking the queen as well. So, you know, if the queen, for example, tries to hold on to that bishop, which it can't do, we'd simply take that bishop and oops, we've got another fort as well. So I think this was a bit of an easier tactic. We'll just double check things with the engine to see that we are right. And yes, so knight b3 was the crushing sequence there. So really the main takeaway with this example here is just always be very mindful of X-rays, because they can be considered as good as regular contact. And where X-rays really become potent is when the piece that's kind of interfering with that X-ray suddenly moves out of the way, and in doing so is making a threat of its own. So that's often how you get double attacks being formed from X-rays. Okay, on to our next example now. Again, we're going to go through the same process here, just taking on the entire position, scanning the pieces, making sure I can account for everything. This looks like a position that might have come from the Semislav Botvinnik, potentially. I recognize this type of setup for black. It might have come from a Botvinnik. We can see both of the kings are somewhat exposed in this position. The black king is in the middle of the board. The white king is still in the middle as well, and a few moves away from castling. And it's questionable even if white would want to castle kingside in this stage. The black pieces are pretty ferocious looking over there. So just making an initial observation on both kings, as that's what my eyes get drawn to. Whenever I look at a new chess position, my eyes just look at the kings. And now let's have a look at the contact between the pieces. The first one that jumps to mind is this rook is placing pressure on that bishop on f4. Not only that, it's also got an X-ray against the knight on e4 as well, and also a further X-ray on the pawn on d4. So this rook here is being a bit of a railgun, just sniping straight through this setup for white. So if white were to simply drop his bishop back to g3, looking to guard his bishop, actually black would just scoop that knight with check. So this piece seems to be placing a lot of pressure in the center here. I can see that there's also pressure with the bishop and the queen along to d4 as well. We've got pressure down here. So actually, it looks like black is really putting white under the pump here. We've got this under pressure, this under pressure, X-rays. We've got this guy under pressure as well. So if I had the white pieces here, I'd think that I need to play very energetically. Otherwise, like the entire position for white might collapse here. And so what I'm looking at here is that a lot of the times, when your opponent is making threats against you, sometimes you can think about, well, what happens if I just ignore that threat and make counterattacks myself? Are there any dangerous counterattacks that we can employ with white? The first thing that jumps to mind is, well, taking on f6 with the knight probably doesn't really lead to much at all, as black would simply recapture either way and there'd be a lot of pressure. So I don't think that really leads to anything. But I think that actually, just looking at this position very quickly, and this is something that my brain did very subconsciously in some of the early moments that I looked at the position, is that this knight that we see on the light square here, and I think this example is probably going to be very instructive for people in understanding how to understand how knight forks get somehow generated out of thin air. This knight is sitting on a light square, right? What you need to understand about knights is that, okay, this knight on a light square is pressuring a whole bunch of dark squares in a short range manner. So as a short range, you can think of it as like this kind of like melee character attacking the opposite color square to what it's sitting on. So it is currently sitting on a light square, and in a short range manner, it is attacking a lot of dark squares around it. Where the knight forks kind of materialize out of nowhere is a knight on a particular color complex. So in this situation, the light squares, with one hop can attack multiple light squares. And so when I look at black's camp, one of the first things that came to my mind was that the bishop on b7 and the pawn on f7 are both sitting on light squares, and they are undefended. A hop into d6 with our light squared knight would be striking two weak light squares here. And so this is a type of pattern that you need to, I guess, drill into your mind to understand that, yes, the knight will be like a short range melee attacker on the opposite color complex, but it has potential to strike the same color complex as itself in terms of like a medium range strike. So this knight here, with one leap, can start attacking a whole bunch of light squares in black's camp. And so I was immediately drawn to knight to d6, striking the bishop and the pawn on f7. And these look incredibly dangerous because taking on f7 would then be another fork. The king and the queen are both on dark squares, so they are forkable as well. So you really need to start looking at color complexes in your games. Notice which pieces are sitting on the same color complex. We can see the king and the queen are on the same color complex, which means that they are forkable. We can see that the queen and the rook are on the same color complex, which means that they are forkable if a knight were to manage to jump here, for example. And then our knight on d6, which is on a dark square, has potential for a dark square fork, right? So the knight comes into d6, threatening f7, which is absolutely devastating. And black would need to do something about that. He has to guard against f7. If only he were able to guard f7 without getting checked on b7, he'd be okay, because one of the things to be aware of in this position is that the bishop is still hanging on f4. So if, for example, white were to just scoop up that bishop, and let's say, for example, it wasn't check, then black would just take on f4, and he'd be okay. It would just be an exchange of a piece. But the issue is that after knight d6, I actually don't see any practical ways for black to just hold his position together, because if black were to, for example, to try to hold onto that bishop by moving his king there, well, he's walked into a discovered check, right? That bishop is eyeing off c7. The knight would jump into f7 with discovered check and pick up the queen. So that's no good. If white were to try to jump into e7 to guard f7, so that picking up the bishop is not check because he can take on f4, well, he can't go to e7 because with our knight there, our queen is x-raying that as well. So regardless of which way black steps with his king to try to hold the position together, he's walking into discovered checks in both directions. And I just don't see any other way to try to hold the position together. Let's say, for example, black tries to guard f7. Well, then we just pick up b7 with check, and then we jump on out of there and we are perfectly fine. We've picked up a free piece. Unless there's some really crazy tactical counterstrikes or continuations, I think that knight d6 here is completely crushing. So I think that's what I'd lock in. So I'll just play out the sequence that I have in my head, and then we'll check it with the engine. So I think that knight to d6, threatening a monster fork here, threatening b7 with check here as well. Let's say, for example, black tries to guard f7. We take on b7 with check, and we just scoot on out of there. And then I think that's a pretty crushing position here. If instead black tries to save the bishop, then we'd be coming into f7 and we'd be taking the queen. So yeah, I think that knight to d6 is what I'd lock in, and it looks pretty crushing to me. Let's have a look with the engine and see what's happening. Okay, so wow, knight d6 is the correct continuation, but wow, I did not expect this. It's actually not that crushing. It's not as game breaking as I thought it was. And have a look at the sequence that the computer wants to employ here as black. This is incredible. So after knight to d6, the computer wants to sacrifice the queen. The computer is going to take on f4 with the rook. We give the check, yes. We are going to be picking up the queen. The king simply slides across. We pick up the queen. And now have a look at what the computer wants to do here. He's not recapturing that knight immediately. He's simply taking this central pawn. With pressure here, that knight has got nowhere to go. It's trapped there. And so, yes, it's giving this still as an advantage for white, but actually I really, really underestimated the potency of the counterattack that black had here. It's only giving this as about plus 1.5 for white, even though we've just won the queen. But in the process of doing so, we've lost our bishop on f4. We're about to lose the knight here on h8 as well. We've lost our central pawn. Black has got a lot of pressure. All of his pieces are incredibly active. His king is very safe as well. So yeah, white has got an advantage here, but it would still take a lot of really precise play from white here to convert this position. So I think that was a really instructive example. Actually, we saw a lot of fascinating knight forks. We saw some fascinating potential discovered attacks as well. But then just seeing how the computer, I guess, just acknowledged that, yes, I'm losing my queen, but in the meantime, whilst you're going off and grabbing my queen, I'm going to take your bishop. I'm going to centralize my pieces. I'm going to take 2 pieces and a pawn for that queen. And it's actually generated some pretty dangerous looking counterplay, and it's given itself a really good fighting chance. So really instructive example, actually. Okay, let's go to our next one. Okay, so once again, we'll be following the same process. So just taking a look at the entire position, registering all of the pieces, making sure I'm accounting for all of the pieces on the board. My brain is immediately looking at initially the position of both kings. Black's king looks a bit airy at the moment with all of these advances in front of his king. White's king isn't looking too happy as well, as we can potentially imagine a lot of lines being opened up and the black pieces storming through. So I think that both kings at the moment are somewhat compromised. And in terms of contact between pieces, I guess the initial one that my eyes get drawn to is the fact that the knight on h4 is currently under attack. In terms of other contact points, let's see, we've got black with some pressure on the dark squares around white's king. We've got a nice little x-ray here from the bishop on b7. And in terms of white, we've got some pressure on f5. We've got pressure on this knight, which is currently guarded by the pawn on f5. We've got pressure on d6 as well. And so a lot of things to juggle in this position as well. But of all these different contact points and x-rays and everything that we've just had a look at, the one that my eyes and my brain are being drawn to immediately is the pressure here at the moment with this knight being supported by f5, which we can snap off the board. This reminds me of the other example that we saw a bit earlier where black had that knight deep in enemy territory in white's camp, and we were able to remove the guard, remove the pawn that was guarding that knight, and then we were able to simply scoop it up. So this tactical puzzle here reminds me a bit of that previous example. So what I'm thinking here is, can we just take on f5? Because as soon as that pawn disappears, that knight will be under threat to simply be lost. And not only is knight to f5 threatening to win that knight, we're also threatening the queen as well on a7, which would be a massive fork as well. Have a look at that. So knight to f5 here is really jumping out to me and just screaming to be played. So let's just make sure that there aren't any crazy counter strikes or any funny business that black can do to generate up some counterplay. And yeah, I don't really think that there is, because that threat against the queen is just really, really powerful. Black would need to do something about that. So I'd be locking in knight takes f5. If black were to retake, we'd simply be picking up that knight on e4, and we've just won a free piece, basically. We are threatening here, we're threatening here, we've got x-rays against h7, we've got a weak backward pawn. This just looks absolutely crushing for white. Okay, so that's what I'd lock in. I'd be playing knight to f5 here. And it looks like, just looking at this position, I'm guessing that black's last move was g7 to g5, thinking, hey, I'm going to be pushing your knight back, your knight's going to retreat, and I'm just going to start rolling forward with my kingside attack, and I'm going to destroy you. But he overlooked that, well, white's knight doesn't have to jump back. We can actually sacrifice and undermine your piece. So even though this was probably one of the easier ones that we've seen so far, I think it's a very important pattern, because I know that a lot of club players will see any piece that's guarded by a pawn and think that, oh, that piece is impenetrable. It is sitting on a throne. It can never be dislodged. But actually, what we've seen in a number of examples is that the supporting pawns a lot of the times can be undermined. And once that happens, if the process of undermining that pawn comes with some sort of big threat, then the piece that was undermined can suddenly just be scooped up a lot of the times. So very important pattern for people to store in their memory bank. Okay, so let's just double check that with the engine. And yes, so it looks like knight takes f5 was indeed absolutely crushing, and the engine gives rook takes f5 as the best try for black, and we scoop up with the bishop, and that is pretty much game over. It's giving it as +3 for white. Okay, now onto our final puzzle here. And this particular position is actually one that I've seen before. And I put this position into this video deliberately because I think it is incredibly instructive to showcase, I guess, the process that we've gone through in this video. What I'd like is for people to pause the video here. It is black to play. Have a think about what you would play here as black. Go through that same type of process that I went through. Scan the board, register the pieces, look at the contact, look at potential future contact, explore potential counter strikes by your opponent, and have a think about what you would play here. Pause the video for a moment and challenge yourself. Okay, I know that a lot of players in this position would have really been drawn to the idea of bishop takes a6, taking this pawn here, because they can see we have pressure against this knight, which is being guarded by a pawn at the moment. We've seen that pattern before. If we simply take this pawn here on a6, it looks like a free pawn to us because the idea is simple. White retakes the bishop and we scoop up that knight. That is a free pawn that we've just won. This looks fantastic now for black. We can mobilize our queenside pawns, and black is laughing in this position. So is that all that there was to this puzzle? Bishop takes a6, is that the crushing continuation here for black? Well, no, it's not actually. And for those of you who saw, I guess, the follow-up, congratulations. If you didn't, I'll give you a hint. There is an absolutely crushing continuation here for white. And in this position here, after bishop to a6, black is actually completely lost. There is a very crushing move. If you didn't spot it initially, maybe give yourself another moment to pause the video and have a think about, can you spot what white does here to crush and punish black? Okay, so white has got the very calm and quiet, but deadly, queen to c1. Have a look at this. We have created a new x-ray against the black queen on c7. And remember what we said about x-rays throughout some of the examples. A lot of the times you can consider x-rays just as good as real contact, right? We have got a new x-ray against the black queen with an absolutely devastating threat. White is threatening to come into e7 here with check. Black would have to move the king, and then he'd just lose the queen. The queen on c7 would be lost if that were to happen. So we've got this huge threat to win the queen, but not only that, if black were to spend a tempo to guard against that threat, which he has to do, well, your bishop's still hanging here on a6. So actually in this position here, white is threatening that, and he's threatening to come in here to e7 as well. So we've got a classic double attack here. Okay, but is it as simple as that? So if black tries to move his king to f7, guarding against that threat, to say, hey, that knight move now is no longer with check. So actually, you got to watch out. Your queen on c1 is unprotected as well. And I'm x-raying your queen now. So remember that. In this position here, white actually needs to be careful in how he proceeds. If he first takes that bishop on a6, actually that's not the right way to go about it, because we take the bishop here as black on b5, and oops, you can't take the bishop back because your queen would be hanging. So once again, remember some of those techniques that we went through in the earlier example. What we saw was that as white now, hey, I can't take this guy here because I have an issue with my b5 bishop. And remember what we did with some of those earlier tactics. Well, our thought process was like, well, our issue is the bishop on b5, so let's just make that not an issue anymore. So we'll simply exchange that piece after black retakes. Now we can take on a6, and now problem solved, and white emerges a piece up. I hope that people found this example interesting. I personally find it incredibly instructive because of how tempting that move is. Bishop takes a6. A lot of club players would be incredibly tempted and wouldn't be able to resist taking that pawn on a6. They'd be so pleased with themselves that they've seen this tactical possibility that they can pick up the knight. They've won a pawn, they've mobilized their queenside, they're going to win the game. They'd be very pleased with themselves. But it's really important when you see a tactical opportunity for yourself that you don't let your emotions get out of control, and that you make sure you follow up and double check that your opponent doesn't have any crushing counterplay that he can muster up against you. Because in this particular position, bishop takes a6 is actually completely losing after queen to c1, an absolutely crushing, quiet move there, creating an X-ray. Okay, well, there we have it for today's video. Thank you everyone for sticking through it all the way to the end. It wasn't easy. We had some challenging tactical puzzles there, a lot of very interesting different motifs. We had some interesting forks, some pins, some discovered attacks, pieces being undermined. I hope that people got some instructive value in seeing kind of the process that I go through to try to dissect a brand new, fresh tactical position. I hope that you got some insight in terms of, how the knight moves around and how it can generate forks, looking at the different color complexes. And I hope that you got some techniques that you can apply to your own games as well. So thank you very much for watching. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, do like and subscribe, as it does help the channel. Thank you.